Hello, everyone. This is the 107th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle of the 1888 Letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview American author and journalist Mr. Clemente Lisi as we discuss Diego Maradona's 7 years at Napoli. Mr. Lisi appeared previously on a podcast discussing the 1990 and the 1994 World Cups. Mr. Lisi has been a journalist for the likes of New York Post and the New York Daily News. He has also worked as a senior editor for abcnews.com. And Mr. Lisi is also a contributor to Religion Unplugged. He is also the author of The U.S. Women's Soccer Team, An American Success Story, and his recent book from last year, The FIFA World Cup, A History of the Planet's Biggest Sporting Event. Mr. Lisi also has a Substack called Planet Soccer. Welcome, Clemente. Good to have you back.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Before we get into Maradona's Napoli years, can you put in perspective where he was at this point in his career from his beginning in Argentina up to his 2 seasons at Barcelona?
Yeah, sure. So what you're asking me is to really go over the first 24 years of his life, which is a fascinating story, which is, he was born in 1960 to a very poor family outside of Buenos Aires. And it was a very young age that he started playing, like many Argentine and Latin American kids at the time and currently, he started playing soccer in the streets. And it was there that he was discovered by a talent scout, by a youth coach, a man named Francisco Cornejo. And he has a beautiful quote that I'll read of what he said after he discovered this very young Maradona. He said, quote, "When Diego came to Argentinos Juniors for trials, I was really struck by his talent and couldn't believe he was only 8 years old. In fact, we asked him for his ID card so we can check it, but he told us he didn't have it on him. We were sure he was having us on because although he had the physique of a child, he played like an adult. And when we discovered he'd been telling us the truth, we decided to devote ourselves purely to him," unquote. So he was, like many superstars in the sport, at a very young age, it was very clear that this player, this potential player, was a prodigy. And growing up, Maradona has given many interviews in subsequent years saying he would sleep with a soccer ball. He was very much in love with the game. He idolized players like George Best and other players, but in a few short years, he would surpass them in terms of talent and success. But he made his debut at age 16 for Argentino Juniors. In doing so, became the youngest player ever to play in the Argentine Premier Division. He spent 5 years there from 1976 to 1981, scored 115 goals, and of course, naturally, a very small club. He went on to play for the team that he always idolized as a child, which was Boca Juniors. And he had a very successful first season there and won the title. And it was actually the only title Maradona ever won in Argentina. And at that point, like many Latin American players, he then is big enough of a name where the European clubs start to knock on the door. And Barcelona came around in after the 1982 World Cup, which was not successful for him. He had been red carded. Argentina did not do so well in 82. But nonetheless, he had shown enough talent. He almost made the 78 team, but was cut the last minute. Ironically, the same coach, Cesar Luis Menotti, was the one that was coaching Barcelona at the time. And in 1983, for $7.6 million, which was a transfer record at the time, he moved over to Barcelona. And his 2 years at Barcelona were fraught with problems with injuries, with famous on-field brawls, including a famous one with Anthony Goicoechea, known as the Butcher of Bilbao, threatened Maradona's career with an injury. There was an all-out fight in the 1984 Copa del Rey final, and it was clear that Maradona's time in Barcelona was really up. The fans would chant things against him, racist things against his heritage, which was part native, part Indian, and really not a really good time. And it's funny now that in death, a lot of Barcelona fans fondly remember Maradona, but it was a very terrible time there. And in the end of the day, he really had to leave Barcelona. Barcelona was willing to get rid of him. He wanted to leave. And at that point, he was almost considered a player that maybe his star had fallen. Maybe this potential that this young Maradona had, maybe it was never going to come to fruition because clearly in Spain and with Barcelona, it had not. And so now in 1984, Maradona reaches a crossroads. Where does he go next? What does he do? Is his career over? And that became sort of the big talking point that year.
What was the status of Napoli at this point in the Italian Serie A landscape and in general its history up to that point?
Yeah, so while this is going on in Spain and Barcelona in another soccer universe over in Italy, Napoli is one of the best Southern Italian teams. Now, that's not saying very much because the powerhouses in Italy were the trio of Juventus, Inter, and Milan that pretty much dominated the Serie A, the Campionato, for decades and decades and decades. Napoli had been founded in 1926 and have finished second on two occasions, 1968, 1975. So they had come close to winning the title several times. They featured great players over their history, Omar Sivori, Jose Altafini, Dino Zoff in goal through the decades, but never good enough to win the Scudetto. It was the most elusive thing for them. And so this was not the kind of team that could afford to bring in the big names, even though they had in the past had some names, but then those players would move on to Juventus or to Inter or the bigger clubs. So in a way, Napoli maybe was a feeder team, a mid-table team, and just not the kind of team that could ever really compete for the title. And so this was where Napoli was in the early 1980s. They were in this was their role in the Italian soccer scene.
Can you describe in sociological terms the whole North versus South conflict in Italy and Napoli's role in it?
Yeah, so soccer and politics in Italy very much collide. They're very much one and the same. Italy's, if you know anything about Italian politics, Italian geography, the Italian economy is pretty much predicated on a geographical divide between the industrial north and the mostly agrarian south. Not that much different from the United States, let's say post-Civil War, right? And this had started with the Italy's unification in 1861. Italy had been characterized by this very strong north-south divide, and there was this growing economic disparity, for example, that led many Southern Italians to immigrate to Argentina, to the United States, to Canada, to places around the world between the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Under Mussolini, things didn't change all that much, and then post-war Italy became much more industrialized, much more modern, joined the G7, but the South still remained a place where poverty was higher, unemployment was higher. And so this North-South rivalry, which is witnessed day-to-day life through immigration or through economic terms, of course, the outlet for this is where? It's in the stadium, on the soccer field. So it becomes Napoli's role, Napoli, the team, becomes the embodiment of this is our team and how will we fight the very wealthy North. So it paralleled what also was happening on the soccer field. And so, but the Northern teams were too powerful. They had a lot of money. They gobbled up all the talent. And so there was this big divide, not just economically with everyday people, everyday life, but even on the soccer field in terms of putting out a team, putting out a product. And so the two crisscrossed each other. And so when those two things collide, you get a lot of very passionate fans, a lot of very passionate people because the team doesn't just represent the sports team, it becomes a symbol of their culture, their lifestyle, and just in their geographic location. And that's very important to know.
So is the saying true, see Naples and then die?
Well, as someone who's been to Naples many, many times in my life, my family is from there. My parents are immigrants to the United States from Naples. Yeah, Naples is a beautiful city, and, maybe one of the most underrated places in the world. And that saying is to say that it's such a beautiful place that yeah, that there's nothing that can beat it, right? And people, Neapolitans are very proud of their city, their culture, their language, their food, all those things. And a lot of what we know about Italy around the world is really Neapolitan. Pizza, pasta with clams, spaghetti with clams. These dishes, they're very much characteristic of the South or of Naples, not of the North. And so, the Neapolitan music, opera, a lot of these things come from the South or from that city, and they represent Italy around the world. And so, yeah, that saying is, is to say, hey, this is a beautiful place, and there's nothing that can beat it. So once you see it, you can die.
The Napoli president of these years was Corrado Ferleno, who would be a constant in the Maradona Napoli saga. Can you describe him for those who may not be familiar and his role in signing Maradona?
Yeah, so Ferlaino is still alive today. He's I think 92 years old. So, but he's no longer associated with the club. But like many Serie A clubs at the time, and still a few today, the team is run by one central owner with a lot of power, who makes all the decisions in terms of players, player personnel, coaches, the money they spend. Ferlaino had been an engineer, a building contractor who was born and raised in Naples. And he took over majority stakeholder of the club in the late 1960s, 1969. And he, of course, becomes a central figure in the Maradona signing because the club couldn't afford him, right? Even though his career seemed at a crossroads, like I mentioned, he was still in demand. There were still teams like Juventus and other teams who would have been more than happy to chase after him, right? But it turned out that the local government had defaulted. Italian politicians in Rome had sent someone to Naples to run their finances, basically. And with the help of the Bank of Naples, the Banco di Napoli, they put up the funds to finance the transfer. And so that's how the transfer then came to be with the help of the banks and the local politicians who saw a way to help this team because they realized Maradona was an exceptional player and a chance like this may not ever come again. So Ferlano becomes in this story sort of the hero in the beginning, and then as we will go into it, Ferlano and Maradona would butt heads over the years, and that would become a big source of contention, of course.
Now, was it surprising at the time that a player of his stature was signing for essentially a mid-table team at such a young age?
Yeah, so Maradona's time, like I mentioned, at Barcelona was so bad that he was considered finished by many. And it's true that Napoli had finished the season before in 11th place, narrowly avoiding relegation by a point. And it remained a very unusual transfer because Serie A had become the world's best league at that point. It was loaded with superstars, and but it was very unusual that Maradona would go to a team like Napoli. But in the end, it would be prove to be a good move for both sides because Maradona needed a new team and Napoli needed something to jumpstart their team in a way that had been languishing for too many years in the mid-table and more recently than after that was relegation threatened.
Yeah. Now, getting back to the financing, were there any shenanigans reported at the time on how Napoli had raised the money?
Yeah, well, whenever you talk about Naples and that part of Italy, unfortunately, the word Camorra comes up, the local mafia syndicate, which runs all kinds of illegal activities. And there were rumors at the time that the local mafia had been somehow involved, but those allegations were later proven false. I will mention, though, that a reporter was present at the Maradona's introductory press conference at the São Paulo Stadium and asked Ferlaino that very question about was the mafia involved in this transfer? And he was like thrown out of the press conference immediately, right? And so, over the years, there's been a lot of allegations about that. But the truth is, the local mafia didn't really get involved with Maradona's life until much later. And that was for very different reasons. But when it came to the transfer, it was mostly done through the banks and it was totally legitimate. The problem with the way it was financed was that Napoli was essentially at the time, nobody really understood this or cared, but they're mortgaging their future. They were ultimately going to get into a lot of debt over the years. And as we know, the post Maradona years at Napoli were not very good. And the team ended up being relegated. And because of that spending, that free spending spirit that not only took over Napoli's finance at the time, but all the Serie A teams were spending money that they really ultimately didn't have. And a lot of teams that were mid-table teams were buying some pretty exceptional players. We should point that out.
Yes. And indeed, and like you mentioned, the Serie A was already the best league in the world. And Maradona's signing was basically the icing on the cake as far as the status of the league, I imagine.
Yeah, no, it was. And the league had already featured Michel Platini at Juventus. And I mentioned some teams that would not seem the kind of teams that would sign great players. Like Udinese had Zico, Daniel Bertoni, who was Maradona's countryman. He was at Fiorentina, just to name a few. So yeah, this was already a league, and it's funny because when Maradona ultimately does arrive in Serie A, it's not even the middle or the end of Serie A's dominance. In a lot of ways, it's just the beginning because
Mm.
more and more players would come in the subsequent years, in the subsequent 10 years. And so, in a lot of ways, Serie A was just getting started in terms of attracting the best players around the world.
It's fair to say that perhaps for his first two seasons in Italy, Michel Platini at Juventus was considered the best player in the world. And Maradona really became the king of football after the 1986 World Cup. So, was he conscious of this? And did the media compare the two?
Yes, so it quickly, once Maradona does arrive in Naples, the rivalry between Juventus and Napoli is already big and growing, and it only gets bigger. And so the Maradona Platini rivalry becomes a subplot of that rivalry. And it was always a big game whenever the two sides met. Napoli had not been able to win in Turin for many, many years. And Platini and Juventus had been very successful in the early 1980s. We should mention that they had gone on to win the European Champions Cup and the Intercontinental Cup. I mean, this was probably the best team in the world, and most of it stockpiled with Italian national team players, and Michel Platini being the big superstar of the league, and maybe the best player in the world at the time. Now, Platini had fallen short at the 1982, 86 World Cups. And I agree with what you said. Maradona's arrival would mark almost a power shift in that decade. Not only would Juventus go down and Napoli go up, but Maradona would ultimately win the World Cup and basically replace Platini as the best player in the world.
Maradona's 7 years are bookended between the first and the very last seasons that were somewhat disappointing. It was really the 5 seasons in between where Napoli were really a force. So let's take a look at this inaugural season, 1984-85. Let's look at the team, the season, the transfer activity. For this first season, Napoli are to be managed by Rino Marchesi. And in addition to Maradona, they signed Salvatore Bagni from Inter, who would become a key lieutenant of Maradona on the field, as well as his compatriot Daniel Bertoni arrived from Fiorentina that season. Also, a striker Domenico Penzo came from Juventus. But it's fair to say, even with his arrivals in this first season, the team is a fairly average team.
Say Maradona's first season at Napoli was nothing brilliant. I mean, that the team finished eighth, but Maradona had scored 14 goals that year. So, on a personal level, he had exceeded the expectation. And so, as you said, it was just the beginning of something. And I think, but that first season by itself was very much average.
Yeah, it's fair to say that he started to gain confidence as the season wore on, and his second half of the season and that of Napoli was probably better than the first half of the season.
I agree with that. And I also want to say that at the time, Serie A was probably like no other league in the world. That it was the most difficult, it was the most competitive. And even though Maradona had come from Spain, I still think that he had to. There was an adjustment period, and not just not just the playing, but also the culture, the language. So that first year was an adjustment for him. But Napoli had signed him for a multi-year contract, so they knew that this was just the beginning of something. And the truth is, as you mentioned, some of the other signings and future signings would come in handy because ultimately this is a team sport and one player can't do everything by himself, even though it seemed like Maradona could do everything by himself many times. A supporting cast is very important. And we also should point out at the time, the Serie A teams were limited to two foreign players, which then later became three in the later years.
Let's discuss some stories from that season that some people might remember. I learned that it took Napoli 4 hours to recoup in cash most of the 6.4 British pounds transfer fee of Maradona. Apparently, they sold 400,000 season tickets. Later in the season, when Maradona, like I say, is more confident, there's the famous hat trick against Lazio. There's also the meeting with Zico. There's the Udinese and Napoli clash in the penultimate match of the season. And that's really very famous because Maradona scores twice in this match, but one of them was a handball. And apparently, Zico had asked him to confess, but Maradona refused. And that's a sign of things to come the following year. I guess for a first season, it was satisfactory, but definitely much more was expected of Maradona.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you summarized it very well. But like I said, it was a multi-year contract, and this was just the beginning. I think, the local fan base was very happy that he was there, and there was a lot of excitement there. And so, yeah, it was just the beginning. And Napoli would spend money in the ensuing years, obviously, to build a team that would then be competitive in Serie A, or more competitive anyway.
Let's get into the second season, 1985-86. Napoli started showing their ambition with signings to complement Maradona's talents. Now, the new manager is Ottavio Bianchi, and the new arrivals include the Verona goalkeeper Claudio Garella. From Sampdoria, we have the defender Alessandro Renica. Former international Ruben Buriani arrives from Roma, and other former internationals like Eraldo Pecci from Fiorentina, and most notably Bruno Giordano from Lazio up front. This is a much more competitive Napoli.
The 85-86 season really proved to be a turning point for the team. And, Napoli had its best finish in 5 years. They finished third that season. Maradona, of course, scored 11 goals that year. And it was very characteristic of Maradona starting with this season that every season leading into the World Cup that summer would always be a time when Maradona really put his foot on the gas. He really wanted to be in top shape because ultimately, while Maradona loved being at Napoli and he loved club soccer, he really loved his national team. So whenever, and we see this again in 1990 and again in 94, right? So leading up to the World Cup is always a time for him to say, okay, I have to reach peak condition, which he did that season. Of course, it totally helped that in attack he was playing alongside Giordano, who at Lazio have been one of the league's best scorers. And, maybe overshadowed by the national team. He really did not become a star for the national team, for the Italian national team. But Giordano was probably one of the best strikers in the world. You mentioned Claudio Garella, which was a starting goalie for Verona, who had won the Scudetto. They pulled him away. So there was real money being spent. And then you mentioned Renica, the center back, who really would become a key figure in the future years as well. So this was already the beginning of something that the fans were sensing, the beginning of something where, oh, finishing in the top three, top four was already a sign that they, like you mentioned, their ambition was growing.
And some of the memorable moments of that season include the brilliant goal he scored against Verona. That's is often referenced where he took the ball. He was on the left side of the field, and he took the ball and immediately lobbed the ball. And I guess the goalkeeper, I don't think he was expecting it because he didn't even do anything, and it just went in. And that was like a 5-0 Napoli win against the defending champions Verona. And there's also the brilliant free kick against Juventus in November 85. That's also often referenced for the manner in which he scored. And that was again, that was also a statement of intent by Napoli defeating Juventus, who would become champions that season. So that season, Napoli finished third behind Juventus and Roma. I came across this story that in a radio interview, he was questioned by Paolo Rossi and Cabrini, and Maradona stated that scoring a goal in Italy is worth two anywhere else. And anyone who watched the Serie A would agree with that, Serie A at that time. And as far as his favorite woman, he diplomatically responded that his mother, of course, although Raquel Welch did not leave him indifferent. We can clearly see progress is being made by Diego Maradona at Napoli. In 1986, we have the World Cup, and Maradona becomes the greatest player in the world at this point. There was already a press circus around him anyway, But can you describe the pandemonium surrounding him at Napoli after this?
Yeah, so by 1986, so Argentina, the during the World Cup, the Neapolitan fans, the Napoli fans had really embraced the Argentina team and were celebrating his victory on the world stage, which was a sign that maybe he can win, for them as well. And by 1986, he had already achieved, I think, or had started to this godlike status, not just in Argentina but also in Naples. And it reached levels that the city has never seen before, and I think no fan base in any city has ever seen before because it became this, the city and Maradona became one and the same, right? But you have to also look at the dark side of that, which was Maradona could not go out in public. As a result, he lived a very secluded life in Naples. He would go to the training ground. He would have to go out late at night or overnight. He would have to have bodyguards or police escort. And it would be this lifestyle or this inability to live a normal life that would lead him to really to his cocaine addiction and other vices. So it's funny that, he tried to live this, he lived almost two lives. There was Diego, the man that people knew, and this private person. And there was Maradona, who was the person everyone saw on Sunday at the stadium. And so, but it reached a point that was, I'd say, almost suffocating. But this was the price of fame, especially in a city that's very passionate about soccer and a place that had never really witnessed success. And this was, Maradona winning the World Cup, and to say the best player in the world plays here was the beginning of then we would find out that victory in Mexico City would then spill over into the Serie A.
So before we get into this third and historical Scudetto season of 1986-87, was there a genuine feeling that the Neapolitans felt that they could pull off a Scudetto? And was Maradona publicly indicating this at this point?
Yeah, Maradona very much has set his sights on trying to win Scudetto because, yes, the World Cup is the pinnacle, but also trying to win the championship of the best league in the world is another hurdle that you want to, another box to check off the resume, right? And so Maradona remained very much in top form after the World Cup. And along with Juventus and Inter, Napoli was among the favorites for the title, but always an outsider, of course, right? Maradona had indicated from the start that Napoli could compete for the title, and ultimately they would win the double. They would win the Coppa Italia as well that spring, and Maradona would score 10 goals, and then they would be aided in the end by 8 goals from an unlikely player, Andrea Carnevale, who would come off the bench and pretty much in those final weeks help the team achieve what they never achieved before, which was win the title.
So for this 1986-87, Napoli still managed by Ottavio Bianchi. As you mentioned, Andrea Carnevale came over from Udinese. More importantly, Italian international Fernando De Napoli came from Avellino. Francesco Romano came from Triestina. Giuseppe Volpecina came back from loan from Pisa. The team is again growing stronger as we still have the likes of Giordano, Bagni, and a young Ciro Ferrara establishing himself that season. So the team would, against all odds, would win the Serie A title that season. The double, we should say. There's never been that many doubles in Italy at that point. So that in itself was such an achievement, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the arrival of Carnevale and De Napoli. They would be key for the team that year. You mentioned Romano. He would come. He was an attacking midfielder. He would come in the January transfer market. But the real turning point that season was when they defeated Juventus 3-1. They took over first place, and they never really looked like. And then it became almost like a cavalcade of victories. It looked like they were not going to give up, and it very much was a historic season. And for that reason, there are people still today that remember that title because they what do they say in Italian? You don't forget the first time, the first one. And so this very much it remains key and central to the hearts of many Napoli fans who were alive back then. That was, again come to light this past spring when Napoli won the title again for the first time in 33 years, and there were all these memories again of this first one with a really a magical group of players. And this core group would then pretty much be the team that would get Napoli on the road to success for the next 3, 4 years.
With Michel Platini retiring at the end of that season, there was clearly a changing of the guard between Juventus and Napoli at the end of that season. We have to mention that they played in the UEFA Cup for the first time in European competition for some time, but they lost to French club Toulouse, which was a surprise at the time. The turning point of the season, which also again plays into this changing of the guard situation, was the match against the Juventus at Turin on match day 9. And Napoli won 3-1 to establish themselves as the league leaders ahead of Juventus, and they would hold on to this to the end of the season. So that was a reference point, defeating Juventus at Turin. That paved the way for the league title. At the end of the season, Maradona said that Napoli's title had made him even happier than winning the World Cup. He also became a father for the first time. That's at the end of that season. But also, he was dealt with a paternity suit earlier in the season that could have derailed that season.
Yeah, like you mentioned, it was historic, and these other distractions you mentioned, the UEFA Cup elimination, the paternity suit, it never really came into full fruition, really. But like I said, it was a historic season, and Maradona himself did say after winning the title that he felt like this title was almost bigger than the World Cup because he had not won the World Cup at home. He had won it in Mexico, not in Argentina. And this, he felt like he won it among his people. And this really much consolidated his lock as a Neapolitan. He was one of them. And not only that, he had helped them avenge the North. And it's very interesting, just culturally at this point, to see this player from another country, but with very humble beginnings and grew up very poor. But he had the mannerism, the characteristics, the slickness, the slyness on the field, a lot of the characteristics that define what it is to be a Southern Italian. And he became an adopted son, and winning the title forever linked these two together, the city and him. And look, in a lot of ways, it was just the beginning of what would be a glorious 3, 4 years.
In cases like Verona's title in 1985 and later with Sampdoria in 1991, these Scudettos were essentially the zenith and the ending point of an adventure. But certainly with Napoli, it seemed to be just the beginning of, I guess, a dynasty or reign. Was this the belief at the time?
Yeah, very much so. This was the beginning of a dynasty of sorts. And in a way, it was, as long as Maradona was there and healthy, that was, they thought they can contend for the Scudetto. And, the truth is, the team would contend for the title every year between 1988 and 1990. And ultimately, they would win another title in 1990, and we'll get into that. But they were very competitive. And then they start getting competitive even in Europe. And so that's when you start to see the team become, today we would call it almost like a global brand, or they would be known around the world. And this was, Napoli was becoming synonymous with winning, but also in the same breath as Inter and Milan and Juventus, which was, considering he had only come a few years earlier and the team was, almost relegated the year before he showed up. It was an astounding turnaround and change of events, really. And for Fellaini, this investment had paid off, and he saw Maradona very much as an investment, and someone he did not want to lose his grip on, because he knew that without Maradona, the team would not be, in a lot of ways, it's interesting. This is a controversial statement, but the Argentina side of 1986 was not that talented if you take Maradona out of the equation. This Napoli team in 1987 is talented, but without Maradona in that lineup, it's very much a mediocre team. And so I mentioned it's a team sport, but with Maradona was the kind of player, a game changer, the kind of player that opposing defenses were afraid to face, someone who could do nothing for 80 minutes and then with the flick of a foot change the outcome of a game. And so this was the genius that was Maradona. And so, Napoli knew it, and they had the best player in the world with them. And so as long as he was there, they felt very confident that they can compete for more titles.
In hindsight, Do you think the paternity suit that we mentioned was that really the start of his serious problems at Napoli?
Yeah, the paternity suit was sort of the first indication that he was living this, like I mentioned, like a double life, like a shadow life. And so you bring that into the equation with the increased use of drugs, his party lifestyle. That certainly did not help him. I mean, players tell stories about how he would not show up for training. He would he would come late or he wouldn't show up at all. And when if he didn't show up at all, the players would say, "Oh yeah, well, he must have had a great night last night. He didn't come." Right? But Maradona was the only player who can get away with that. Not come to training for 3 days and then show up on Sunday and score 2 goals, right? And so as long as he was producing on the field, these other things were not seen as distractions, but I think they were damaging to him personally. They could be considered a distraction for the team. They weren't at the time, but ultimately these things would build up into an avalanche and ultimately consume him as a person.
In the summer of 1987, 1 year after winning the World Cup and now the Scudetto, the world is his oyster. He was not only a football star, but now a cultural personality around the world. This is a phenomenon that maybe younger audiences might not understand because we live in a world of social media where every player is famous. Can you explain this vis-a-vis Maradona at that time?
Yeah, so by 1987, Maradona was not just the best player in the world, but at that point he was even in the conversation as better than Pelé, right? For the best ever. And Maradona at that point became like a buzzword. He became synonymous across the planet, and this is even before satellite TV had grown. The marketing, for example, that we know today did not exist. So to be famous in 1987 meant that you had to be exceptionally good at something, and so good that the world's newspapers and television stations had recognized that. And so that had been the case. Maradona was, if you said the word Maradona anywhere on the planet, people would know who you were talking about. Or if you said name a soccer player anywhere on the planet, people would say Maradona. I mean, today that would be Messi, maybe. But you're right. In today's world, we live in a world where social media, every soccer player is famous, even the ones that don't do anything, right? And so, at the time he had a Puma contract, so he appeared in some Puma ads, some print ads, but really you had to be a consumer of these publications to know that he was in these commercials, right? So in a lot of ways, he had done some commercials for McDonald's in Argentina as a young player, but the opportunities that we know of today didn't exist, the marketing opportunities. So he truly was famous, almost like a movie star in a way that you're right, younger generation might not understand that, but he had become like Pele, where people just knew who he was all over the world, and he became synonymous with the sport, and that's saying a lot, and for Napoli that was a huge deal because the ability to have people around the world want to wear the Napoli shirt, jersey, that was something that was extremely a source of pride for fans, and just knowing you have the best player in the world on your team, like I said, is a confidence boost. And in a league like the Serie A, where defense is still prime, still important, and to have defenders afraid to face you, because they know the kind of footwork he has, the kind of ability, work rate, and everything else, says something. And so, yeah, it's truly impressive looking back now, all these decades later, of his fame. His notoriety was so known around the world, and in a way that you couldn't pay for that marketing. Today, you would buy TikTok ads or something, but back then you couldn't do that. You had to actually, there was no YouTube, there was no Twitter, so you couldn't watch these goals over and over again. You had to, in a lot of ways, transcend people's minds, and he did that. And I think that's why we still talk about it today.
Let's get to the 1987-88 season. Napoli spent even more money to bring in more quality players. We have the Brazilian striker Careca, one of the stars of the 1986 World Cup, come over from Sao Paulo. We have a Torino defender, Giovanni Francini. He was an international defender to strengthen the defense. Napoli were signing players, quality players, to add to a team that already included internationals like I said, Ciro Ferrara, Bagni, De Napoli. Giordano. This 87-88 season, again, still under Ottavio Bianchi. Napoli seemed to be running away with the title for most of the season. But that was the debut season of Arrigo Sacchi at AC Milan. They would become Napoli's main rivals for the next few years.
Yeah, this season remains the most disappointing during the Maradona era. It's funny because this was maybe the only season where on the eve of the season, everyone thought for sure they would win the title again, right? It was, the city was prepared for another party, and it seemed like Napoli would repeat, and the fans were, like I said, prepared. But, and while Napoli proved to be the most offensive team in the league, because Careca was a formidable scorer, Careca is the type of player that today would end up in the Premier League. He would not be in Serie A, right? Him and Maradona dominated the scoring charts, but like I mentioned earlier, strong defenses win the title, and AC Milan had probably the best defense that year. They had a very young Paolo Maldini, they had Franco Baresi, right? They defeated Napoli 3-2 in the final weeks of the season. Napoli at one point squandered a 5 point lead. We should remember that at the time, 2 points for a victory and one for a draw, right? And so in the end, it seemed like got away from them. I should mention at the end of the season there was a player mutiny and a kind
Yes,
of
I was
a
about to
lot of a
say
lot
that.
of
Yeah.
things a lot of things happened at the end of the season, that a lot of recriminations because it seemed like an opportunity lost.
Yes, and in fact, I would say Napoli that season were even stronger than the previous season, and they seemed to be running away with the title before they imploded, perhaps because of the mutiny. And the mutiny was by senior players like Bagni, Giordano, and I believe Moreno Ferrario. Some of the senior players they mutinied against Ottavio Bianchi. And the last few weeks of the season, Napoli just imploded and lost many games. And the match on May 1st is one of the most important matches in probably calcio history because it was that day that Milan leapfrogged over Napoli. They'd been closing the lead in the weeks before, and this is the debut season of, like I said, Arrigo Sacchi. The first season of Ruud Gullit, and Marco van Basten, who was injured for most of that season, but he was getting back into the squad in this latter half of the season, and he even scored in that 3-2 win at San Paolo. That was a reference point as well where Milan took over. Berlusconi's Milan won the Scudetto. But the mutiny was blamed as a reason why Napoli failed to win the title. We must also mention that in the Champions Cup, in the first round, Real Madrid eliminated Napoli. And at the time, there was this narrative that even though Maradona has done so well, he has consistently failed in European competitions. And this seemed to further that narrative. Another thing is that with the arrival of Careca, now you have the Magica trio, Maradona, Giordano, and Careca. But that was only for one season. It seemed like it would be a dream season, but the mutiny derailed the dream season, perhaps.
Yeah, we should point out that the mutiny was led by Giordano. Even though Maradona was not part of the mutiny, Maradona very much was pro underdog, and Maradona was very much sympathetic to the mutiny. Now, I'd be remiss not to mention the fact that when Napoli failed at the final hurdle, rumors that the mafia had rigged the season was very much a talking point, because the argument was all this illegal gambling. If everyone bet Napoli and Napoli wins, you're going to bankrupt the local mafia. They can't pay out all the winners, right? Now, it's interesting because Marco van Basten, many years later, claimed that in a subsequent season that they had rigged it for Napoli so that Italy would have two representatives in the European Cup, right, that year. So the losers always find a way to justify the defeat. Now, Fellaino, the owner, he very much wanted loyalty. And so he sided with the manager. And so he got rid of all the players you mentioned in the mutiny. They were all gone by the next season. Like over the summer, they were all dealt to other Italian teams. And those players' careers pretty much ended. And Napoli basically rebuilt those key players. They replaced those key players back on the summer transfer market. And, but Fellaini was very much someone who wanted loyalty. And so I think this failed coup, was a way for him to exert his power as the owner and to say, this is my team, I'm in charge, I back Bianchi, I want him to be the manager, and that everyone is replaceable. Maybe not Maradona, but everybody was replaceable.
Well, in that summer of 1988, Ottavio Bianchi did survive this rebellion. But for the first time, we also see Maradona attacking him in the public via the press. Now, what was the general mood of Neapolitans in this feud?
Yeah, like I said, as long as Maradona was there, they were confident, but the fans grew now into a very much a love-hate relationship. And this is the years where starting now, the Napoli fan base would be fractured between the pro Maradona people and the pro Fadlaino people because the two would come at odds. Because, Maradona was a very strong personality, and in a lot of ways, he was like a coach on the field. And as long as Maradona was happy, everybody was happy. But Fellaini paid the bills, and he very much wanted to exert his power. Bianchi was the manager, but Bianchi as a manager was not. It's not. He wasn't like a Mourinho, or he didn't have a strong personality. He was a very quiet man. I don't want to jump ahead, but when they famously won the UEFA Cup, Bianchi left the field and went to the locker room, and then had to be coaxed out just to celebrate. He wasn't. He was a very quiet man, and but this was a team that I don't want to say anybody could have coached, but quite possibly anybody could have coached because as long as you have Maradona on the field. But like I said, the fan base was still confident, but they started becoming camps. People that thought maybe Maradona has too much power, people that thought Fellaini was, an insufferable owner. And we see that a lot in Serie A and a lot of Italian teams. Berlusconi would become that person later on. So it became an interesting, again, another crossroads. And look, when we're talking about Maradona and the Napoli years, it was like a soap opera. And it was like, uh-oh, another season. What's going to happen this year? And so it was never a dull moment for the journalists and or the fans. And in that way, it kept Napoli on page one of the papers. It became a big talking point. But as long as they were competitive and they were winning, people excused a lot. And then so that's where we are now in 1988. This is where we are.
Yes. So in the summer of 1988, for the 1988-89 season, like you said, there's a clear out. So the likes of Salvatore Bagni, Giordano, Ferrario, and Claudio Garella were cleared out. In their place came younger players, such as Giuliano Giuliani in goal. He came from Verona. You have Massimo Crippa coming from Torino. Brazilian midfielder Alemão arrived from Atletico Madrid. And this is the first season with three foreign players authorized.
Correct.
And and you have defender Giancarlo Corradini coming from Torino, Luca Fusi came from Sampdoria. Just about all these players would or were international level players. So Napoli strengthened themselves that season with younger players to replace the mutineers. Maradona, like we said, he criticized Bianchi and the team's transfer policy that summer. He stated that like instead of Alemão, he would have preferred to see his Argentine teammate Sergio Batista. He wanted to have Salvatore Bagni remain with the team because he's very close to him. At one point, Ottavio Bianchi stated that if Maradona thought he was a club president, he should just come down and give him his dismissal papers. Eventually, I think Corrado Ferleno calmed the waters, and in the following days, Maradona publicly apologized for his outburst. He was ready for the season. This would be a season where Napoli and Maradona just scored a glut of goals. And with Giordano gone, Carnevale was back in as a starter, and he scored a lot of goals with Careca alongside him. But this was the season where Inter broke all the records with Giovanni Trapattoni as manager and with Lothar Matthäus and Andy Brehme. And they just ran away with the title, despite Napoli having a very good season. But Inter was just that much better.
Yeah, no, you're right. Inter, this was the record Inter. So, it was interesting because the three main protagonists, because at this point Juventus is fallen adrift. So you have the Milan side dominated by the Dutch trio of Van Basten, Rijkaard, Gullit. You have Napoli, which is at this point very South American with Fede Galimao and Maradona. And then you're right, you mentioned the Germans with Inter, and Inter would win the league by 11 points over Napoli. It was a runaway. The Napoli fairy tale that the Maradona saga would not really take place in Serie A, but it would take place that season in the UEFA Cup. And obviously, we're going to talk about that because Maradona proved the critics wrong that he could win in Europe, and that season in Europe turned out to be an amazing run.
That run in Europe, we also have another memorable moment by Maradona where ahead of the match against Bayern Munich, the loudspeakers were playing, well, as Maradona was warming up, they were playing the famous song by Opus, Life is Life. And that's another reference Maradona moment. And that season also, they could have won the cup title. They lost in the final to Sampdoria, but I think the UEFA Cup was a bigger prize. That was their priority, given the fact that they couldn't win the Scudetto. We also have the birth of his second daughter that season for Maradona. This 1989 UEFA Cup title was significant because, as you mentioned earlier, it kind of put to bed this whole concept that Maradona was disappointing in European competitions. Do you remember if this was a prevalent criticism in Italy at that point?
It was not really a big talking point in Italy because the Italian teams in general had dominated the European competitions, the three major competitions. And so as long as Italian teams were winning these tournaments, it wasn't very much, it wasn't so much whether or not Napoli can win it. And I should point out the UEFA Cup that year was extremely competitive. Napoli had to beat teams like Bayern Munich. They had to beat Juventus, which they came back from 2-0 to win 3-0. So a lot of exciting games, but outside of Italy, I think, and within, just in general within Europe, the argument was, yes, sure, Maradona is dominant at the World Cup, he's dominant at, in a short tournament, he's dominant in Serie A, but can he compete against the best teams in Europe? And Napoli had always fallen short in Europe, and Napoli had never won a major European title. So this was yet another hurdle to overcome. Could they win this? Because they had fallen so short in the Champions Cup. And we should remind people who don't remember pre-Champions League that these were home and away, elimination. So a good team could be eliminated in the first round, right? And then for Napoli to go back to the European Champions Cup in 1987, for Napoli, the champions of Italy, to face Real Madrid in the first round, I mean, one of them had to go, right? So the Champions League today is much more forgiving. You can lose a game or two in the group stage, and you can still win the whole thing in the end, right? So we should remind everyone that that's sort of the format, for the UEFA Cup as well, home and away. And so, yeah, there was some criticism, but mostly it didn't come from Napoli fans, that's for sure. Napoli fans were happy. They were happy that the team was competitive and that this was a team that was built to win. And so, like I mentioned, a lot of the criticism of Maradona not winning in Europe was coming from outside. Of course, that is all gone when they win the UEFA Cup, in the home and away series against Stuttgart, where they win the first game at home, and then in the return leg in Germany, where a lot of Italian immigrants in Germany made that almost feel like a home game for them. We should point out that that final also featured a future Inter player named Jurgen Klinsmann, who then would come to Italy that summer.
So we come to the summer of 1989. Maradona participates in the Copa America. Afterwards, for the first time, he appears to be tempted away as he's linked to Bernard Tapie's Olympique Marseille. Can you describe this saga?
Yeah, I think Maradona with the off the field drama and the intensity, the pressure of Serie A, I think Maradona wanted to play somewhere where it was calmer. And he would say this in subsequent interviews at the time and later in his career that he felt like he had done everything he could. They won the league, they won the UEFA Cup. There wasn't much else to win here, right? And he thought just for his own sanity, he wanted to leave. Like I mentioned, he had already won several trophies, and the city had become a tough place for him to live. Now, at the time, Marseille had offered to double Maradona's pay, and Fred Laino had told Maradona that if they won the UEFA Cup in 1989, that he could move, he can leave. But Fred Laino reneged on his word, right? And Maradona was stuck in this contract at Napoli. Now, we should also remind people that Marseille at the time was almost like the PSG of today. They had charismatic owner, they had money, and they already had Chris Waddle, Enzo Francescoli. They were trying to build a team that could be competitive in Europe, and they would be years later. Now they would also be dogged by lots of controversy and match fixing that would come later. But Maradona would never go to France, and he would never go there, and he would never forgive Ferlino for this. And so that summer of 1989 became problematic because Maradona, like he normally would fly off to South America. That summer he played in the Copa America, and then he went on vacation to Argentina, and he basically said, "I'm not coming back." And so they were at an impasse at that point.
For this 1989-90 season, that would culminate with a World Cup on home soil and Italian soil. Napoli started the season without Ottavio Bianchi, who left after winning the UEFA Cup, and their new manager was Albertino Bigon. As far as player personnel, there's not much change. We do have the arrival of an unknown player called Gianfranco Zola from Torres. Also, we have the arrival of Massimo Mauro from Juventus and defender Marco Baroni from Lecce. But otherwise, they maintained their backbone. But of course, as the season started, for the first few weeks of the actual league campaign, Maradona is refusing to return, and that's another drama that is related to that whole Olympic Marseille saga.
The mood was tense,
Mm.
to say the least. And I think Napoli fans at the time were worried, will how competitive can we be if he's not here now? You mentioned the key player, that they had gone after a very young player named Gianfranco Zola, who, if you could reproduce Maradona in a factory, Zola would be that person. He was same stature, ability to score free kicks, and Maradona would eventually come. I think in September, season had already started, and Zola would become his protege in a lot of ways and off the bench. But it was uncanny how Gianfranco Zola was very much a photocopy of Maradona, and the kind of player that maybe never really fulfilled his potential now with the national team, and later he did it with Chelsea. But he was a very young at Napoli. He had come from a serious seaside, so he was making his debut here, his professional debut in Serie A. So yeah, in a lot of ways, Fellaini was smart to say, well, if Maradona isn't going to be here, then we're going to basically put in his understudy, somebody who looks just like him, somebody with the same attributes. But Maradona would eventually come. The soap opera would, continue, the drama would subside a little bit, and as everyone knows, that would become another magical season.
Yes, yes, Napoli would won their second Scudetto. There's some stories from this season. Obviously, in addition to the emergence of Gianfranco Zola, another famous image of that season is Maradona wearing Franco Baresi's kit after their match against AC Milan. That's also become a very referenced image. He marries his childhood sweetheart, Claudia Villafane, on November 7th, 1989. He also gets in some trouble when he claims that the World Cup draw was fixed to help Italy. But otherwise, on the field, after returning, he helps Napoli win their second Scudetto.
Yeah, I feel like the this season was even better than the first one Napoli won in 1987, because this was an all-out battle between Napoli and Milan. And the race would come down. I think this is probably one of the most exciting Serie A seasons ever. The season would be decided on the final day of the season, but on the penultimate day of the season, Napoli would win at Bologna, and then AC Milan would lose in stunning style to relegation threatened Verona. And in the end, Napoli would emerge victorious at the end. And so a repeat of what happened the last time didn't occur. Milan did not overtake them. Napoli was able to get them in the end. And we should point out too that over the course of that finale, Napoli was awarded an automatic 2-0 win against Atalanta because
Yes, yes.
Alema was hit in the head with a coin. And so the sports judge automatically gave them a victory when that game, I think, had ended in a draw. So there was a little gamesmanship there potentially. Now that they would have won the season maybe anyway, but like I said, constant back and forth between these two teams. Look, that was the Milan side that dominated Europe. Let's not forget that. So if Milan was the best team in Europe against Napoli, maybe the best team in Italy, and so you had two of the best teams in the world competing week to week, and both sides. I mean, if you look at the lineups for both sides, especially the Milan team, exceptional players, and in many ways the backbone of the Italian national team in those years. But yeah, I think it was a super exciting season, and I'd put that down as maybe one of the best seasons ever. And for Napoli to emerge victorious, it was just the ultimate coronation for Maradona and for Napoli.
Now we come to the 1990 World Cup. In fact, in our first podcast, we discussed this World Cup. The key takeaway is the semifinal versus Italy at Naples and the aftermath of that. Now, can you describe how this particular experience would shape his final season?
Yeah, at this point, we should point out that if the 1982 Brazil team is the best team never to win the World Cup, then the 1990 Italy team is not that far behind on that list of teams. And so Maradona became the most hated man in Italy for Argentina eliminating Italy in the semifinals. He was still beloved in Naples, and we should point out that many Napoli fans were cheering for Argentina that day, even though, a very famous banner says, we love you, Maradona, but we are Italian. Now, Maradona had played into the whole North-South thing on the eve of that game, we should point out. I don't want to belabor it because we know we've spoken about it on previous podcasts, but he basically said to the Neapolitan people, "Oh, they expect you to be Italian, today, but the rest of the time they treat you like you're nothing. You're not Italian. They treat you like a second class citizen." And that was his gamesmanship. That was his way of trying to pull the fans on his side, and he was very smart about that. And I mean, as a journalist, he gave the best interviews. He said whatever he thought. And so, but he became a marked man. He had a target on his back at that point, in the sense that Italians hated him. And we should remember that in games during the World Cup, he was booed by opposing fans in Rome and Milan and other places, right? So something seemed to have changed after that semifinal. And so, the 1990 season, 1991, he comes back. He was still upset about losing the World Cup final, but, ready to take on the challenge. But as we know, this was very much the beginning of the end for him. But like I said, he was very much a marked man, and Italians really, really disliked him. And there was a poll conducted in the summer of 1990 of who the most hated person is, and Maradona came first. So this is where Maradona is now in the Italian landscape. I mean, he's still considered a god in Naples, but there is this strangeness now that is more pronounced than ever before.
Let's take a look at this final season in Italy, the 1990-91 season, where was the most disappointing as far as results on the field. Get into some of the off-field issues as well. So Napoli are still managed by Albertino Bigon. As far as signings, they get striker Andrea Silenzi from Reggiana. Veteran goalkeeper Giovanni Galli arrives from AC Milan. Giuseppe Incocciati arrives from Pisa, and Giorgio Venturin from Torino. So it would be a disappointing season on the field. As you said, Napoli was dependent on the moods of Maradona. And if he was not doing well or if he was not happy, that's how the team was. And it reflected on the results. And it was during this season that he would continuously express his desire to leave. He was fined a number of times by the Federation for dissent and indiscipline. And he would basically train according to his wishes, and he would skip training if he felt like it. There was an incident where He locked himself in his home and refused to fly to Moscow when Napoli were playing Spartak Moscow. He eventually had to be forced to go by private plane. And so many of the stories that season where he's just very unhappy. I think during the league season, he never scored from open play. He only scored from penalty kicks. That was a season where Sampdoria won the title with Vialli and Mancini. We all know what happens in March after a match against Bari. That was the beginning of the end, but probably the end had started much earlier than that, it seems like.
Yeah, so we should say Napoli put up a very poor title defense. The only bright spot was the season opener of the Super Cup. They beat Juventus 5-1. But striker Andrea Silenzi proved not to be the goal scorer everyone expected. The team lost two of their first three games. Like you mentioned, Maradona tested positive for cocaine in March, and he was gone. And Napoli would finish eighth, and it would be sort of the Napoli cycle was over. Just a year earlier, they had been celebrating, and it was all over. And so, it came to an end in a very strange way, kind of abruptly. And so, that is always something that people remember from that season. It's sort of almost an incomplete type of feeling after the high of coming off of a second title the year before.
Yes, it would be on April 1st that he left Italy for Argentina. He would subsequently be banned for 15 months. There was just so many stories with him that season. There was also the story where former Argentine star from the 1960s, Jose Sanfilippo, sued Maradona for slander. I don't know if you remember that. He had said that according to he thought Pele was the best player in history, and Maradona accused him of being a traitor, so he sued him, and eventually it was settled out of court. But it just showed there was just so many of these stories hanging around him, and it was just a very sad and depressing season for him, where newspapers would say like he's playing like an old man, and he was only 30 years old, but he looked much older than he was given the pressures of the culture.
Yeah, no, I want to add to that when Maradona was presented to the fans, 80,000 people showed up in 1984 to watch him dribble a ball for 5 minutes, right? And then for him to leave like a thief in the night without the chance to say goodbye it was a sad end to what had been a glorious 7 years. Of course, the reaction was riddled with conspiracy theories, but the reality was Maradona had a huge drug problem, right? And it was no longer tenable for him to live this double life. And I think had he left 2 years earlier, maybe, history would have been different. But the 15-month ban pretty much ended his club career, at least temporarily. As we know, he would emerge in '94 at the World Cup. But Maradona was a never say die kind of figure. But the way he left Naples was a way that was, left a lot of a bitter taste in the mouth of many, and it was disappointing because it felt very abrupt, and because it was, and it was nobody would have ever guessed that it would have ended this way, but it just did almost overnight, like the whole thing was a dream.
Do you think he was burnt out by the pressures of culture or all those other things?
No, I think he was burnt out, but I think he also had this massive drug problem and this double life that he was living, and it was you couldn't put all those chemicals in your body and play at a high level still. I mean, he did it, but he was also getting older and things were catching up with him. I think that's what happened. Ultimately, it caught up to him, and I think is also his unwillingness to cooperate. And him and Federline pretty much were they weren't even talking to each other anymore at this point, and so the relationship was fractured, and the team suffered as a result. I mean, because in the end of the day, then on the field, that final season he was there was not, they were not competitive at all. And then Napoli would have to spend the next 5 to 10 years selling off all their players and becoming a mediocre team all over again.
Did he still have the back pains? Was this still an ongoing issue with him?
He had the back pains. He also had pains to his ankles. We should remind everyone that at the time, the way the rules were set up, it pretty much favored defenders. The rules changed later where, defenders got more yellow cards, but Maradona was constantly chopped to the ground. He was constantly taking painkillers. He was taking painkillers since he was 10 years old, shots to the legs so he can play through the pain. And so, as a 30-year-old, he was already, like you said, looked much older because he had almost been crippled by how tough. We should remind people that Michel Platini's career ended earlier than it would have ended at age 32. Marco van Basten's career would end early as well. We don't see that today. We live in the Ronaldo Messi world where these two players have been at the highest level for 20 years, which is extraordinary. But the way culture was set up at the time, the way soccer around the world was set up at the time, it favored defenders, and Italian defenders were tough. And so a player like Maradona could never have played at a high level, even if you get rid of all the drugs and everything else. It would have been very difficult to maintain that level into his 30s. And in the end of the day, I think he was forced basically to leave. Now he was suspended, but I don't think even without the drug suspension, I don't know how long this could have gone on, really. His time in Italy.
Now, let's step back and discuss the Napoli experience as a whole. If you had to trace back, what was the reference point where perhaps he should have left to a less pressured league and atmosphere?
Yeah, no, I think I hinted around this earlier, but I think winning the UEFA Cup would have been a great way to say, okay, my time here is done, you know. But the people couldn't let him go. The ownership didn't want to let him go. They thought it was like a lemon. How much can I squeeze it and get juice out of it? And I think 1989 would have been perfect, right? But it didn't happen. And history could have been different had he left. And maybe he would have won a European Cup with Marseille, who knows, right? But the pressures of Serie A and his lifestyle, and then on top of everything else, that would have been a perfect time. He would have gone on. He would have left on a huge winning note. Now, of course, they won in 1990, and that only made it worse, I think, because winning in 1990 felt like, oh well, we're still winning. Like, let's keep things going. The Napoli of those years is almost like a rubber band. If you pull a rubber band enough, it'll break. And I think that they got to a breaking point, and that's what happened.
Given his upbringing, do you think the fact that Napoli were in a way fighting against the Italian football power establishment, did that endear him more to the fans?
Yeah, Maradona represented the common person, every man. He was the underdog against the powerful. And Maradona was that person already. And then you put him in the Italian North-South context, and then he becomes the embodiment, the spirit of the Neapolitan people, right? And like no foreigner had ever before, maybe since. And so, it's his personality and his upbringing and his mentality almost fit perfect like a puzzle piece inside this context. And so you couldn't have scripted that. You couldn't have planned for that. And so, yeah, it became us versus them, very much so. And you win two titles and the UEFA Cup in a 7-year period. Yeah, you're challenging the powerful North, right? You're challenging the power that Inter had, Milan, Juventus. I mean, Inter and Milan were strong, but Juventus was pretty much wiped away here. They were like a non-factor in those later years in the 1980s. And so, yeah, but as people know, this was a temporary thing. After 1991, we go back to that. Now I mentioned the Napoli Scudetto of last year, right? That team, if you eliminate Roma and Lazio who won in the early 2000s, the Italian Serie A has been won only by Juventus, Inter, and Milan in those years. So even post Maradona, nothing changes. It goes back to where it was before. And so that's an interesting thing, and so that's how unique a figure I think he is in the context of these 7 years and sort of his embodiment. And that's why if you still go to Naples today, you think Maradona is still alive and playing on the team today. You would not know, maybe more so in death. In 2020, Maradona passed away. Italy and Naples in particular is a place where nothing gets done. Nothing. I mean, things take time, but they renamed the stadium within a week. The Stadio San Paolo became the Stadio Diego Maradona like overnight. They changed the signage. They erected a statue to him, and his death was very much felt in Naples. Like, this is one of our own. One of our own is gone now, and so it was a very emotional time for Napoli fans. And that shows you that the connection that was established in these years remained very much alive, even all these years, decades after he was gone. And so it's extraordinary. I don't know of any player on any club team in the world that has that connection, that bond.
Yes.
So it's interesting.
How important was he in consolidating Serie A to be the best league in the world?
Yeah, so I mentioned that, but when Maradona's arrival in 1984, there were already some great players there. We mentioned Zico, Falcao, these other players. But Maradona arrives, and then some of the best players in the world continue to come. And then when the number of foreigners goes from two to three, we see we see even more players coming. And so yeah, that was a very important move, to have the best player in the world in that league. It was a magnet for other Argentines who had traditionally played in Italy. It's not unusual, but to have Brazilians, to have other European players. I mean, you have the best German players, they're playing in Italy. The best Dutch players, they're playing in Italy. They're not playing in Spain. They're not playing in England. They're playing in Serie A. And so that's key. That's important. And these teams are winning European competitions and everything else. So yeah, it was very important. And once Maradona is gone in 1991, the power of Serie A, only lasts a few more years. I'd say maybe until the mid 90s. And after that, with the start of the Premier League and more television revenue going to other leagues, Serie A's power disappears, and the best leagues in the world are now elsewhere. But but yeah, Maradona was right in the middle of all that, and in a lot of ways.
In 1985, Maradona changes his agent. Jorge Sitterspieler had represented him in the beginning, but from then on, it was Guillermo Coppola. How was his influence on Maradona regarded in these later Napoli years?
Yeah, Coppola was, I'd say, a bad influence, very much an enabler. For people who are boxing fans, you have, Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson and Maradona are very similar in that they were surrounded by people that maybe made things worse for them, not help them. Don King. Don King to Mike Tyson is the Coppola to Maradona, right? And Maradona would have a falling out with him years later. And the truth is that Maradona also could not be managed by anyone. He was his own boss, for good or bad. He had his own ideas, and it was very difficult, really, to, how do you manage a player? How do you, and Coppola would steal money from him ultimately, and ultimately really take advantage of Maradona. And like so many athletes before and since, managers often take advantage of the athlete because the athlete is too busy playing or performing and cannot really be worried about his finances. And ultimately, Guillermo Coppola was really not a good influence on him.
I think in an interview, Ciro Ferrara implied that Maradona's problems were always with the management, and he was always good with his teammates and did not seem to have any issues. Was this always the case?
Yeah, it's true. Maradona never scolded a teammate on the field for a bad play or a missed pass. Was the ultimate team player, which is pretty extraordinary to think that, he was the team captain at one point. It would be very natural for him to blame others. No, he was very much, if those things were done, they were done private. But he was also a very generous man. I mean, there's stories players tell, there was one incident where Maradona was at the training ground. It was right before, maybe it was a Christmas holiday or Easter maybe, and there were some youth players there, and some of them were trying to get back home, and he overheard the conversation, right? And he told the trainer, hey, give this money to this player. I pay for his train ticket. So he's very much, that was the kind of person he was, very generous. There were people who would say, there was a very famous story about a young man, a young boy who needed some kind of organ transplant, and Maradona played in this charity game on this dirt field, which you can still find clips of on
Oh,
YouTube,
yes.
and raised money, for for him in this basically this friendly, on this dirt field. And so, but that was the problem with Maradona, wasn't that, it was very generous, but everybody was looking for him. Everybody had their hand out. Everybody was, he was almost like a godlike figure. It's like, oh, I need to touch you. I need to be with you. I want to, and that becomes suffocating for a player. And, we all know the very famous HBO documentary on Maradona. That documentary really encapsulates the feeling, from Maradona's point of view. And while it could be very endearing, my thoughts on that was that it was very suffocating, and that no human being could live under these conditions. And so, yeah, it's interesting, but on the field and in the team context, he was like everybody else, and he treated everyone well. And I think that's why he was so loved. I mean, there is no former teammate of his, either at Napoli or Argentina, or any club team he ever played on, will have a bad thing to say about him. And that's interesting. And then when, Maradona gave interviews years later about his drug problem, he did say, "Look, I never hurt anybody. I just hurt myself." And that's, to a certain degree, that's true.
And his cultural impact on the city of Naples will probably live on into the next century, I imagine.
I think it will never go away. I mean, I was in Naples just in May, right after they won the title, and there are people who are younger than 33 years old, or younger than 35 years old, who never saw him play, and they wearing his jersey. There's murals everywhere. It's like he's omnipresent. And so I agree. I think in 100 years from now, people will still say, yes, there was this great player named Maradona. He played here, and he's one of us. And it's an extraordinary thing. For anybody who doesn't believe me, I say just go to Naples and just walk around, and it becomes this omnipresent figure. It's truly fascinating in terms of sociology, in terms of psychology. It transcends sports, it transcends soccer. It's interesting, and it's just very fascinating. And how this bond has been created and never broken, because Napoli and other teams have had superstars, right? But you don't see that connection decades later. You just don't see it.
So, in closing, I want to have each of us discuss our observations on Maradona's 7 years at Napoli. I guess I'll start. So, for me, it's a question of a linear progression, except for that final season. As a football fan, I would say he clearly marked my life, and I feel privileged to have witnessed those years. You get tired of constant comparisons between him and Messi or him and another player. What I will say is that I can't see many players to be able to win a Scudetto with a team like that, with an average team like that. Only Maradona was able to pull off something like that. It was said that Zico could have been to Udinese what Maradona was to Napoli. But I think for some players like Zico, they arrive at Italy near the tail end of their career. We have to specify how important it is that he came to Italy while still a young man. How important that was that he had all those years where he could develop and be the best player in the world, which he already was already for many people. Unfortunately, you mentioned that Italian calcio destroyed every player. Platini, Rossi, Rummenigge, all these players in their early 30s were already burnt out. Maradona was no different, unfortunately, with or without all those other problems. We cannot overstress how important it is for a team like Napoli to win not just one, but two Scudettos. An Italian football friend of mine told me once that for a team like Napoli to win a Scudetto, it's equivalent to five for Juventus. That is true, because as you said, it's only usually Juventus and the Milan teams that generally win the Scudetto. For a team to win two Scudettos in the space of a few years, it's significant in the history of football. Napoli's rise also coincided with the descent of Juventus for those latter 80s years. But don't forget, you still had the rise of AC Milan, and Inter were also credible rivals. In fact, we have to point out that Napoli had to compete with the likes of Juventus, the Milan clubs, Sampdoria, Roma, all those teams. Nowadays, in most leagues, there's always maybe one or two teams that have a credible chance of winning the title. But in Serie A, there were all those teams who were competing for the Scudetto. And Napoli was able to not only match them, but surpass them in many cases. I'm also reminded of a story around 92. I think Paul Gascoigne had joined Lazio, and there would be constant comparisons with Maradona. And at that point, I think Andrea Carnevale was playing at Roma. And I remember he said, like, he was sick and tired of people comparing him to Maradona, that he wasn't even worth Maradona's boot. I also remember Platini once mentioning that whatever Zidane could do with a ball, Maradona could do it with an orange. And it just shows how respected and revered he was by his contemporaries and other stars of his era. I'm also reminded of a documentary on Steve McQueen's life where he passed away very young, at a young age. I think he was like 50 years old when he passed away. And they were asking his son if he regretted that his father had died so young. And his son said, nah. He said he lived two lifetimes in those 50 years. And I feel like Maradona lived three lifetimes in those 60 years. In closing, I want to echo what you said about if there's ever been a player who impacted a city like he did. And I remember after Napoli won the Scudetto in 1987 for the first time, at the cemetery at Naples, somebody had spray painted that you don't know what you missed. I can't see that scene playing out anywhere else. It just shows what an impact he had, one man had to one city. I'll let you, as another favorite son of Naples, to have your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Those are great words, and that's true. I do think that he lived many lifetimes in that 60 years. In that way, Maradona is forever. He's immortal, right? In that way. And yeah, I agree that I find the arguments over who was better, Messi or Maradona, tiring. And I for one have always said, Messi needed to win the World Cup to surpass Maradona. And I was at the World Cup final when Argentina won, and I was happy. I was happy because I thought finally we could end this conversation, this discussion. And I knew that Maradona probably would have been thrilled to see Argentina win the World Cup. And so in that way, it was a great tribute to him. He had passed away only a few years before. We should point out that Napoli won the Scudetto this past spring, almost playing out the same scenario we saw in '86, where Argentina won the World Cup, preceded by Napoli winning the title. People in Naples are very superstitious, they're very religious. And so, in a lot of ways, they believe that Maradona had a hand in this, that he's like a divinity. And so, even in death, Maradona is credited with helping Napoli win. And so, it's not unusual if you go to Naples today and still see the banners of the championship from last year. You see Maradona's picture and everywhere as if he's on the team now. And so, yeah, and so he's very much a part of the team forever, in that way. Yeah, look, for me, it was the golden age, and I was lucky to have been alive to see it, and almost in a lot of ways spoiled considering the ensuing years. I was lucky to have seen him play once in person at the São Paulo. I went to see Napoli Modena, the 1987 Coppa Italia, and right before the season started, it was Careca's first game. Maradona scored a goal. Napoli won 4-0, and so to even say I saw him in person play once, thinking back to that is something that I cherish very much, that memory with my father and my cousin. But no, yeah, when Maradona died in 2020, it was like a family member passing away in that way. And so, and we've seen other players die even recently, and you feel that connection to them either through video or through a World Cup or through a memory. But this was like a relative dying for people in Naples and for people in Argentina, and there's a strange link between Argentines and people in southern Italy, I think, because of him. But yeah, no, it was truly, truly an amazing time, even though it ended the way it did. Maradona would come back to Napoli years later, despite having multiple tax problems and other issues that he, was always able to court controversy. But ultimately, he came back. He came back for Cito Ferrara's final game, final farewell game. He was there for that, and then he came back, many many years later. It's a shame that he never really took part with the team. He never became a manager. He never became a spokesperson. He never, he was never part of the team in the future. I think probably because he could never really visit the city without having 20 bodyguards around him. And so that was part of the problem. So he never really, I think he was happy to be liberated from it. He everywhere he went though, he always spoke highly of the people of Naples. And I think he felt like he was one of them. And that makes him unique and that makes him forever loved, I think.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. You may contact me on my blog and on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, and his Twitter handle is at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify, on Google and Apple Podcast, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. The link to Mr. Lisi's books and the Substack link have also been included on the podcast and blog uploads. So, Clemente, thank you very much. This discussion brought back so many memories of my childhood into the teenage years where Maradona was the undisputed king of football. So, thank you
Absolutely.
again.
Yeah, thank you.